It was the kind of night that clings to the skin, heavy with humidity and the scent of the earth after a recent storm. Amelia stepped out of her apartment, locking the door behind her, casting a glance at the city skyline barely visible through the foggy streets. She'd never agreed to a blind date before, but her friends had assured her that this one would be different, special. After months of quiet loneliness and nights spent with only her phone screen for company, she relented, thinking perhaps it was time to shake things up. He had a striking appearance. Tall, with a face that seemed sculpted, his features sharp but somehow comforting. His eyes caught her attention immediately, dark and magnetic, seeming to flicker with an otherworldly glint whenever the streetlights hit them just right. He greeted her with a warm smile that seemed to hold the promise of mystery. They spent the evening in a restaurant tucked away in a narrow street, one of those obscure places that looked abandoned from the outside but buzzed with quiet energy within. Dim candlelight flickered across the tables, casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls. The ambience felt thick, like a fine fog that filled her lungs as much as it did her sight. The other patrons, hunched over their own meals in the corners of the restaurant, seemed to fade into the background. She noticed that most of them wore hoods that kept their faces obscured, but she was far too focused on her date to consider it odd. Amelia found herself captivated by him, drawn in by his every word. He spoke about the arcane, of forgotten gods and ancient rituals, things she found herself oddly comfortable hearing despite how little sense they made. The wine he'd ordered tasted dark, earthy, and rich. She felt herself relaxing, as if her senses were dulled, lured into a strange lull. The restaurant, too, seemed to blur around her as she listened, time slipping away unnoticed. After their meal, he suggested a walk through the woods just outside the city. Normally, Amelia would have hesitated. But tonight, with the world seeming dreamlike and hazy, she found herself nodding, eager to follow him wherever he led. They strolled in silence, the only sound their footsteps crunching on the leaf-strewn ground. The trees loomed over them, shadows tangled in their branches, and the night air grew thick with the scent of damp soil. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to change, growing colder and strangely oppressive. The moonlight, which had seemed bright enough at the start of their walk, was now hidden behind dense clouds, casting the world in near-complete darkness. At some point, the landscape changed. The trees grew taller, twisted, their bark gnarled and scarred. The forest was ancient, untouched, with trees that hadn't felt a human's touch in centuries. She sensed it now, an unnatural stillness. No rustling animals, no wind whispering through the leaves, just silence that pressed in around them like an invisible weight. After what felt like hours, they reached a clearing. At the center was a stone slab, weathered and ancient, surrounded by stones that seemed to form a crude circle. Moss and lichen clung to them, and strange symbols were etched deep into their surfaces. Symbols that her date examined carefully, almost reverently, running his fingers over each carved line. The moon finally broke through the clouds, casting an eerie glow over the scene, illuminating his face, which now looked sharper, more angular, his eyes black and depthless. Amelia felt a prickle of unease, but when she tried to step back, she found her feet frozen in place, as if the earth itself held her still. She looked down, but the ground seemed to shift, twisting like dark tendrils around her shoes, tethering her to the spot. She tried to scream, but her throat was tight, as though invisible fingers clutched at her voice. Her date moved to the slab, raising his arms as if in silent invocation. The shadows around them thickened, stretching, bending in ways that seemed to defy the laws of nature. They wrapped around him, whispering in a language she could almost understand, a language that seemed to hum in the very marrow of her bones. She realized, with a growing dread, that these shadows were not mere tricks of the light, they were alive, sentient beings, creeping closer with each passing moment. The air grew colder, biting against her skin, as the darkness coalesced around the stone slab, weaving into shapes, faces twisted in agony, eyes hollow and yet somehow filled with a dreadful awareness. She felt herself pulled forward, her body moving of its own accord, drawn to the center of the stone circle. Her heartbeat pounded in her chest, faster and louder, drowning out her thoughts as the terrible understanding began to crystallize in her mind. The faces around her took on forms she could recognize, people she'd known, people she'd lost. A neighbor from her childhood, an ex-boyfriend, a high school friend who'd disappeared without a trace. All of them gazed at her now, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes empty yet fixed on her as if pleading for release. She tried to look away, but her gaze was locked, held by some invisible force. Her date approached her slowly, each step precise and measured, and in his hands was a small, ancient-looking dagger. The blade seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, craving what it was made to take. He placed his hand on her shoulder, and she felt his touch sear through her skin, as if burning her from the inside out. The warmth from his hand was wrong, filled with an unnatural heat that left marks she could not see but could feel. The ritual had begun. The shadows closed in around them, whispering louder, their voices merging into a single low hum that vibrated through her entire being. She felt something leave her, a tugging sensation deep in her chest, as though her very soul were being siphoned out. Her limbs grew heavy, her vision blurred, and her body felt less and less her own with each passing second. He began to chant, his voice melding with the hum of the shadows, creating a melody that sank into her mind like hooks. The world faded in and out of focus as she realized the sacrifice was not just of her life, but of her essence, her spirit. He was offering her to something ancient, a force that had existed since time immemorial, a force that demanded blood and fear, that thrived on terror and despair. In her last moments, she saw his face change. No longer human, it had morphed into something monstrous, his skin ashen, his eyes gleaming red like embers in the darkness. His mouth twisted into a sinister smile, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. She was the offering, the gift to whatever dark god he served. Her final thought, as her vision went dark, was that she had not been his date, she had been his prey, led like a lamb to slaughter. The clearing returned to silence, the shadows retreating, leaving only the stone slab and the lingering scent of iron in the air. The demon, now wearing his human mask once more, smoothed his jacket and left the clearing, disappearing into the trees, leaving no trace of the ritual, no sign of the woman who had accompanied him. The forest absorbed her, as it had the countless others before her, and it returned to stillness, as though nothing had ever happened.